Students, now let's have a look at the architecture during those times. In the 15th century, a huge transformation occurred in the city of Rome. With the encouragement from the popes to study the history of Rome, many studied the remains of old Roman buildings.
These studies were used to bring back the old Roman style of architecture, which was characterized by tall pillars, arches and domes in buildings.
Thus, a new style of architecture emerged from the revival of the old Roman style, which was termed as a classical style. As a result, the wealthy merchants, popes and aristocrats employed architects to bring in classical architecture style to their buildings. This also led to the identification of artists individually by their name, who were until then only known as member of groups or guilds, etc. There were a few individuals who had equal skill in painting, sculpture and architecture.
Michelangelo can be cited as a classic example of an artist with skill in painting, sculpture and architecture. The painting in the Sistine Chapel, the Pietà sculpture and the design of the dome of St. Peter's Church in Rome stand as epitomes of his excellence in painting, sculpture and architecture. Another architect, Filippo Brunelleschi, who began his career as a sculptor, designed the Duomo of Florence.
Students, one striking element of the Italian architecture in the 16th century is that many of the features of the imperial Roman buildings. Well students, that was all for today's class. See you in the next class. Bye. Students, in those days, the people had to travel all the way to Italy to see the paintings and sculptures of the great artists, whereas the literature of Italy spread to other countries as well. Students, can you guess what the reason behind the spread of Italian literature to other countries? Students, in the earlier days, the text was only in the form of manuscripts or in the handwritten copies.
The printing press by Johannes Gutenberg, a German, was responsible for the greatest revolution in the 16th century. Around 150 copies of the Bible were printed in the press of Johannes Gutenberg in 1455. In addition, the Europeans were also indebted to the Chinese for their development of paper besides printing with blocks.
By the year 1500, many classical Latin texts were printed in Italy. With the availability of printed books, there was the possibility for students to depend on the printed books instead of depending completely on the lecture notes. This led to the widespread of not only literature but also ideas, opinions and information. Students, isn't it amazing how the idea of books began and how people began to buy books and read books?
The circulation of printed books facilitated the spread of humanist culture of Italy in northern and western Europe from the end of the 15th century.
This clearly points out on how the intellectual movements that happened were limited to only certain regions. Students, one of the striking features of the humanist culture was that it weakened the control of the religion over the human life. Although material wealth, power and glory were aspects of attraction for Italians, one cannot say they were not religious. In fact, the Italians believed that the acquiring of wealth, power and bodily pleasures was desirable and that is not something that is to be wary of. In addition to this, there was interest in good manners. The way people dressed, the way people spoke politely, and skills that are to be learned by a person of culture are some of the important areas of concern. Students, in addition to this, the concept of humanism meant individuals had the ability to shape their lives through ways other than the simpler interest in power and money. This also meant that the human nature was many-sided.
Niccolo Machiavelli, a political thinker, brought out a book on politics for the kings of that period. Machiavelli advised the rulers on how real politics operated in the society. Machiavelli also studied human beings and their political lives. Machiavelli, the political thinker, and other scholars began to study the human society. As these scholars believed that self-interest motivated people, they began to study self-interests of people and the way it is used.
Students, can you think of the status of women would have been during those times? Although the ideal of individuality and citizenship were prevalent in the society, the women were not inclusive in these ideals. It was the men from aristocratic families who were powerful in the public life, and they were the decision makers in the families. The sons of these men were educated to take the father's place in the family-run businesses and in public life, besides sending younger sons to join the church. The dowries acquired from marriages were invested in family business by the men. On the other hand, women were not supposed to interfere in the business run by the men. Another important aspect is that marriages were mainly proposed to strengthen the business relations. This simply implied that the women had a very minimal role while they were looked down as keepers of the households. But students, when it came to the status of women in merchants' families, the conditions were different. In contrast to the aristocratic families, the women in the families of the merchants were forced to play a larger public role, especially when there is a death of the husband. Students, in addition to this, some women were intellectually very creative and sensible towards humanist education.
Cassandra Fedele, who was highly competent in Greek and Latin, was one of the women who questioned the idea that women were not capable of accomplishing qualities of a humanist scholar. According to Cassandra Fedele, a Venetian, even though the study of literature promises and offers no reward for women and no dignity, every woman ought to seek and embrace these studies.
The writings of Fedele bring to the forefront the regard for education during that age. In addition, Fedele also criticized the Republic for the creation of a highly limited definition of freedom, which was support of the desires of men over women.
Marchesa of Mantua, Isabella d'Este, was another woman who was another powerful woman. Isabella is also known for ruling the state while her husband was away.
This is how the writings of the women during those times emphasized on the economic power, prosperity, and education to accomplish an identity in men-dominated world.